Good morning and welcome back as we finish up week 2 of this virtual fall 2020 semester here in Com-101 Mass Media Communication. Interesting, as I finished up last time talking about how the NFL became such an entity over on the Fox network and really took them to new heights. Again, over the last 5 years, the most watched programming on television in America has been the NFL. And it's pretty much been like that for a long time, but just they've really now taken over primetime with that Sunday night game, where at the same time, a lot of the other programming has fallen to the wayside as we've had more of these original programs, not only on cable networks and subscription like HBO or Showtime, but of course, all of your streaming services now have plenty of their own programming. Really thins out the audience, the television audience, except for the NFL. And this is one of the few places, although some of you will stream it, it's very rare that you do it. Pretty much when the NFL is being shown, that's when people are sitting down in front of a television and watching the games. Tonight, of course, kicks off the NFL season. You've got the Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs in action tonight. So it's going to be really interesting to see how big the ratings shoot up. I know that there's going to be some people protesting. They don't like all the politicization of all the sports, which will drive audience away. But still, there are going to be those people who may not agree with all the political stuff, but they're just hankering for a little NFL football. I spent 6 years in Indiana. Hankering is a word that I use now. And they're just hankering for some NFL football to come back. So it'll easily be the most watched program, at least since the whole COVID thing began back in February and March. That's just easy to say. So it'll be interesting to see how big they are or if they fall. And I would say if they're under 20 million viewers tonight, and of course I'll give you the ratings when we come back on Monday morning. If they have under 20 million, it's going to be a disappointment. If they have about 22 to 25 million, that's usually what they should have. And if they have over 25 million, well, then they did just fine. Then they're very happy. So anyway, let's move on to chapter 2, which is the oldest mass medium. And that, of course, is books. Just like your textbook. Da, 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 da. Interesting thing about your textbook. Your textbook is 404 pages long. Now, if you were to go ahead and put this book together, let's say in 1445, you would have to handwrite this one particular book. And the number of months it would take you to finish writing 404 pages usually would take you about 7 or 8 months. And if you think, you've had writer's cramp before, or you have that, carpal tunnel, imagine writing a book of 400 pages by hand. But that's the way things had to be done. That, of course, was until 1447. And that's when a guy by the name of Johann Gutenberg... Oh, I just X'd out of it. Oh, I was going to show you Gutenberg. I ended up Xing out of it. Anyway, in 1447, Johann Gutenberg over in Europe came up with something called the printing press. It was the movable type printing press, where you actually would take a tray, a square tray, and you would arrange letters like on a page. You would then lather it up with ink, press it down on a piece of paper, bring it back up, and now you have page 1 of a book. But now you can do that up to 50 times in 1 hour. Sometimes you'd have to lather up a little more with ink, or sometimes you could just lather it up and maybe get 6, 7, 8, maybe 10 page ones. So now we have a mass medium for the first time. Is now books can be produced on a mass scale. See, up until that printing press, up until Gutenberg's, and we're talking up until the 1440s, very few people on the planet could actually read. Usually it was aristocrats, people of royalty, and monks, As a matter of fact, people found out very early that mass producing these books could help to spread information. And of course, what was the first book that Gutenberg produced? Yes, the Gutenberg Bible. Okay. As a matter of fact, I think the one of the original Gutenberg Bibles is now worth like $250 million or something like that. It's something crazy. Okay. Now let's just step back for a moment. We were talking about the beginning of books. I actually thought books were dead. I thought that once 1995, 1996, 1997 came along, and the internet was really starting to become a big part of our lives, that no one would ever read books again, especially young people. And then, of course, who shows up? Ta-da! This lady. And we all know her. That's J.K. Rowling. She's the author of the Harry Potter series. And if there's one thing about J.K. Rowling that has always amazed me, is the fact that she could produce these long books, 400, 500, 600 pages long, and get young people, 10, 11, 12 years old, away from the video games and get them to sit and read books. And as much as anybody, I firmly believe she helped rescue the book business. Even though the book business isn't great right now, at least it's not like its heyday, but it was something where nobody, I'm going to go play on the internet. What do I read a book for, especially young people? I'm going to play my new video, or I'm going to go in my chat room. That was something new back in 1997, a chat room. And she got people to sit down and read books. And I give her a lot of credit for helping to save the book industry. As a matter of fact, it was at the same time in the 90s when, in helping to try to save the book industry, you would have all these different book chains, like Barnes & Noble and Books A Million and Borders, were suddenly incorporating Starbucks or tea rooms, or they would have little cafes in the bookstores. See, up until then, if you walked into a bookstore, you had books and that's it. Okay? And now all of a sudden you had all these things. And of course, then you could take the books, you could read them while you were there, and if you wanted to buy them, you could. If not, you put it back, no big deal. So it was interesting to see all that happen in the 90s. And that, of course, was until Amazon came along. Amazon, believe it or not, arrived on the scene in the 1990s as an online internet bookseller. That's all they did. For the first couple of years that Amazon did, they just sold books online. Of course, they sold them for a much cheaper price, and you wouldn't have to pay for delivery. And they sold millions upon millions of books. And then that's when Jeff Bezos, the chairman of Amazon, who's one of the richest men in the world right now, he said, you know what, maybe we can send things other than books. And the rest, they say, is history. But let's go back to history, all right? So here it is, America, all right? 1620, as we all know, the Pilgrims land at Plymouth Rock. And a year later, of course, go ahead and bring all the native peoples in, and we have a little thing called Thanksgiving dinner. All right. So the Pilgrims come in 1620. And of course, they bring books with them. By 1640, they had actually started to print their first books. And the first book that was printed here in America was called the Bay Psalm Book. And it was printed at the Cambridge Press, a company that stood where what stands there now, where the Cambridge Press printed the first book in 1640, a little thing called Harvard University. All right. And that's because the Pilgrims knew that education was so important, is getting that wealth of information. I mean, imagine how little you would know in life if you couldn't read. And after what Gutenberg did, and that's when people said, we've got to be educated. We've got to, in order for us to be a successful society, we have to be educated. And the Pilgrims brought that there. And that's how America became such a well-educated society. You know, one of the descendants of the Pilgrims was our second president, John Adams, one of my all-time favorite presidents. As a matter of fact, his biography that was done by the great historian David McCullough is still my favorite book. And one of the things that John Adams did is, of course, he helped write the Declaration of Independence, would later on vote to become the United States, would help secure funding for us to become a country and to win the Revolutionary War, and then later on would become our first vice president in 1789. But between the end of the Revolution in 1783 and 1789, when he became vice president, he was the governor of Massachusetts. And this is what he did. You can blame your truant officers on John Adams. John Adams had Massachusetts become the first state to mandate public education to all children born or who were lived in that state. So when you tried to skip school, blame it on John Adams. And that's why, I mean, in America, I mean, if you find a 12-year-old who doesn't know how to read a book, that's because that child's parents is not doing the right thing and getting them to school. But absolutely, we're a very well-educated society, thanks to what the Pilgrims brought in here to make sure that we all became so well-educated. And it's by reading books. And books, of course, were so available. But, they could be a little expensive. But books were so important. And what's one of the most popular things you see in every one of your hometowns? Library. Every one of your towns. You live in Ridgewood, you live in Glen Rock, you live in Fairlawn, you live in Lyndhurst, North Darlington, Carlstadt, East Rutherford. There's a public library. Who started it all? This young fella right here. Now, he was a little younger when he started in 1731, but Benjamin Franklin started the first ever lending library. Now, after the Revolutionary War, okay, as you can see here, we all know the old saying, go west, young man. So, of course, America started to expand. Now, I don't know if you've ever taken a wagon being pulled by either a couple of bovines or a couple of, team of horses. But if you're taking a wagon and you're traveling, especially if you've got a lot of stuff in your wagon, like your furniture and dressers and everything else, it would probably take you a while. Well, hold on, let me just stop my phone here. All right, we stopped my phone. That was my cell phone, people. Sorry about that. All right, so if you were to travel in a horse and buggy, or a horse and wagon, or if it's being, taken by bulls, to get from like Bergen Community College to the New Jersey-Pennsylvania border would probably take you a full day, if not longer. Now imagine traveling out to places like Ohio or Indiana or Iowa as people were now traveling to go out west, especially to make it out to St. Louis to then follow the Oregon Trail. Things could get rather boring. Well, what did they do to entertain themselves? They would bring books. And it was always interesting because in the beginning it would be stuff of what was happening over in like Europe, or poetry that was written by some of the people in like in the Northeast, in Massachusetts, and that kind of thing. But then once you got out there, the people on the East Coast, which were settling into major cities, what they would like to read, what was going on the West. So they would love these books written about the wild, wild West in the wilderness, and Lewis and Clark and their adventures, and, Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie. And they would go ahead and they would spend hours upon end. Because remember, in the East Coast, by the middle of the 1800s, you come home from work, you got nothing to do. What do? You eat dinner, and then what do? You actually read. Even the smallest little apartments would have a room separate that would be the library. And when you were done with your dinner at night, instead of watching TV or going online, you would go into the library and you would read a book. Okay? And one of the things we did start to see is how influential books could be. And probably no book was more influential in the history of this country than this book right here, written in 1852. Okay? Harriet Beecher Stowe writes Uncle Tom's Cabin. And as you can see what it says, life among the lowly. One of the things that's been there since our country was founded is we have been divided on slavery. And, of course, a lot of the southern states needed the slavery they felt to run their economy. Of course, the northern states are like, this is crazy. You have people in bondage. Are you out of your minds? And of course, something had to break here somewhere. We're now a country, if you look at 1776 to 1851, and we're still a country where people are slaves. What's going on? How could you write a Declaration of Independence where all men are created equal, And we're still 70 something years later got people in chains, people who are being used as slaves. So Harriet Beecher Stowe writes this book. Now it was a fictitious book, but it was based on what it was like for people who are slaves. And it just woke people up. You know, especially if you read a lot of the original text, it made the slaves sound like so incoherent and unintelligent. And it's because that's the way they talked. You know, I'd be telling you what that's be. You know, because they weren't allowed. It was against the law to actually educate a slave. So Harriet Beecher Stowe writes this book in 1852. It sells 300,000 copies in its first edition. Now, when you think about America back then, in the northern states in America, we probably only had about 20 million people. And the southern states had about 9 million people, something to that effect. Yet, you take 300,000 books, and of course, as soon as you finish reading the book, what do? You pass it on to somebody else. So who knows how many people, just in that first edition alone, had read Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it really made a major push in the northern states. We got to stop this. We got to stop this slavery stuff. This is just ridiculous. And of course, there would be some clashes between abolitionists and those who were for slavery, leading up, of course, to the election 8 years after this book came out with the abolitionist presidential candidate, the Republican by the name of Abraham Lincoln. And once he got elected, all the southern states started to secede, and we then had the start of the Civil War. Very influential. And we've seen books like that ever since then that have become very influential. But probably no book had more of an impact on our society than Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. All right. That's enough about books for today. Now, if you look at your attachment, there's your first quiz. And of course, all the answers are found in Chapter 2 of your textbook. And all you have to do is just answer me back in an email, put number 1 in the answer, number 2 in the answer, and so on. And it's worth up to 20 points. So, good luck with your Chapter 2 quiz on books, and we'll see you on Monday to talk about newspapers. Yay!